Thank you to Shauna Olafson and Lindsay Fergia for all their help organizing this event, both in person and online. We really at FCCS rely on these two people an immense amount, and I'm always like heartened when I come and I see Lindsay and Shauna and Joanne and like all these staff members who make the whole program work. And yeah, I think about how many evenings you guys give up for our work. So, and it's really also, you're just as much part of it. Like it's your work too, I think. I would like it to be. An extra thanks to Paige Hohen and the Okanagan Library Special Collections, where we're hosting this event. They've been tremendous partners in organizing everything. Paige has done so much. If you have the opportunity to come down here, there's an exhibit that Paige has curated of Sharon Thesen and Nancy Holmes material, books, all kinds of different things, including all of the editions of Lake magazine that Sharon and Nancy edited together, as well as other kinds of other books associated with the Okanagan or associated with this lecture series. You can also see some of this online. It's pretty impressive, and there's so much in the special collections that we don't take advantage of or really know about. But since this room has been here, I feel like it's becoming more and more of a resource in the university and the community at large. So about Sharon Thesen and the Sharon Thesen Lecture. Sharon Thesen was the first full professor in the Department of Creative Studies and is now Professor Emerita. She is also a renowned Canadian poet and editor. She has published 11 books and chapbooks, including The Good Bacteria, Oyama Pink Shale, and The Receiver. In addition to her writing, she has edited 2 editions of the New Long Poem Anthology, 2 editions of Charles Olson's correspondence with book designer Francis Boldereff, and a Governor General's Award-winning selection of poems by Phyllis Webb, The Vision Tree. Her most recent publication is Refabulations, which is just out this year, which collects and reanimates the longer poems from Thesen's oeuvre, ranging from her first book, published in 1980, to the present. The creative writing program intends for the Sharon Thesen Lecture to acknowledge her contributions to British Columbian and Canadian literature, and really internationally. And to the creative writing program at UBC Okanagan. In her honor, a different writer each year gives a lecture that tackles key issues of contemporary writing, poetics, and Canadian literature. I just want to give you a sense of Thesen as a thinker on poetics, since this is a lecture on poetics. So I'm going to quote from an interview that you can find on Poetry in Canada. This is Sharon speaking. I have pledged myself to the path of error, since much of my imagination is taken up with mistakes, injuries, illusions, illnesses, temptations, amazements, and feats of strength and mercy, such as you find in trapeze artists and nurses. That is a very typical Sharon Thesen sentence. In this way, I'm following our beloved John Keats and his negative capability, the ability to be in doubts, mysteries, and uncertainties, including underlying everything, the mystery of the divine. Poetry is a spiritual second sight, or as someone I forget who defined it, one last look at the ducks. For me, I thought that is very much Sharon, like profound and grounded and beautiful and a little bit profane, maybe. I'm not sure. But thank you for those words that I got to use here. I have a slightly longer introduction for Nancy. Nancy Holmes has published 6 collections of poems, including The Flicker Tree and Arborophobia, 2 invaluable works that do for Okanagan ponderosas what Jared Manley Hopkins did for the Binzie Poplars. Neil Karenzer in Canadian literature calls arborophobia brilliant and deeply philosophical. Writing about the flicker tree in Arc magazine, Lise Gaston quotes one of Holmes' poetic avatars from the collection. Slow me into the wear of my ears and feet. Take me into this place, step by planting step, with crisis clear, with eyes open. And this is what we ask of the flicker tree, Gaston writes, to take us, culpable, angry, unsure, into this place that Holmes knows so well, step by planting step. And this is the Nancy Holmes readers, students, and colleagues have known for decades. Someone who can guide us and someone who can walk with us. As associate professor in creative writing at the University of British Columbia, she has served in numerous leadership roles, including head of creative studies and associate dean, mentoring students, artists, researchers, and colleagues. Central to Nancy's professional and creative work has been friendship, collaboration, and camaraderie. She's the editor of Open Wide a Wilderness, Canadian Nature Poems, an essential anthology on one of our most enduring themes and an act of service to many communities of writers and readers. With Denise Kenny, she established the Eco Art Incubator, an initiative which supported the local ecological art in the Okanagan Valley. And with Dr. Cameron Cartier, she established an award-winning community-based art project about native pollinators called Border Free. Nancy won the 2015 Robert Croach National Teaching Award in Creative Writing for her innovative student project, Dig Your Neighborhood, which had UBCO students writing about for and with the neighborhoods of Kelowna. In 2017, she won the Malahat Review's Constant Work Creative Nonfiction Award. We're going to go back to Sharon for a minute here. In interviews, Sharon Thesen has distinguished imagination in general from poetic imagination. In Thesen's formulation, which she adapts from Coleridge, imagination in general reconstructs, but poetic imagination reveals. The poems of Nancy Holmes are alive with such revelations. Nancy Holmes' contribution to the poetic imagination of the Okanagan is second to none. All poets writing in English from this region write with her as a guide, seen or unseen, acknowledged or not. As Thesen says, the poetic imagination is modest, more Bugs Bunny than Captain Marvel. Knowing Nancy and Sharon both, I am sure that listening to me make these claims about them is deeply uncomfortable. But I also know they both believe in the extreme importance of poetry, of the reading of it, and of the practice of it, and the recognition of it when it is revealed to you. I invite you to join me in recognizing both Sharon Thesen and Nancy Holmes.
That's just a beautiful introduction. Thank you so much. And thank you for reminding me of Sharon's fabulous words, too. I'll be quoting from her again myself tonight a little bit. So thank you, everyone. Thanks, audience. Thanks, people who are here. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Paige, for organizing this, and Shauna and Lindsay, of course, as always. So happy to see all the poets here and the students and colleagues, especially my cherished friend, Sharon Thesen. And hello to the people online. I think some of my new friends from India are online too. So it's lovely to be here with all of you in one way or another. This lecture I'm going to give is called When We Both Were Clothed Alike, Conversation Poetics. And it's for Sharon. Part 1, a model of poetry. Everywhere poetry appears, there is division, separation, brokenness. Poetry carries wounds in and on its body. Stanza breaks stab through the poem. Lines are chopped off, margins are jagged. It stands alone, isolated on the page. It shows us in its body all our damage. Yet poetry also knits things together, braids and merges, From a gathering voice that loops through stanzas to turns in the line that carry words over gaping blanks to the next safe line, to forms and structures that frame and scaffold. The poem holds itself together, even though riddled with holes and cracks. Poetry is both brokenness and wholeness, fragment and cohesion. Both, quote, a stately pleasure dome, unquote, and a seething chasm out of which bursts huge fragments. I get those images from Coleridge's Kubla Khan, a poem which I read over 30, maybe over 40 years ago. It was the first poem I read that I realized was all about poetry. This talk is going to spend a lot of time on Coleridge rather than Canadian or contemporary poetics, so I apologize in advance, but I hope to make a case for relevance. And Coleridge is a touchstone for Sharon Thesen, in whose honor these talks are held. Her master's degree was an exploration of Coleridge's Poetics. Andrew Cocklubar, in the special Capilano Review volume dedicated to Sharon, notes that Coleridge remains crucial to Thesen's Poetics. And as recently as 2019, you can find a poem of hers called Coleridge Was a Libra Too, published in the Cafe Review. In fact, as I've been saying to a couple of people today, now that I think of it, there's kind of a hubris for me even to be talking about Coleridge with Sharon listening in. But I'll start easy and briefly with the famous Kubla Khan. Although Coleridge's Kubla Khan can be read in many ways, right? A poem about the mind, a wild drug trip, an opening for a fantasy verse novel, or just a marvelous bauble of a poem that's a pleasure to recite, it has remained, for me, the poem about poetry. Embedded within me is a conviction that a poem's structural essence is that of an artfully constructed pleasure dome above a sea of icy darkness, a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. Kubla Khan was written in 1797 when Coleridge was 25 years old. Another Coleridge poem that also mentions ice is Frost at Midnight, written 1 year later in 1798. This is the poem that haunts Sharon's poem, Coleridge Was a Libra Too. Coleridge was thinking about poetry at that time of his life. Later, he grappled with philosophy and aesthetics and wrote philosophical texts way more than he wrote poetry. In fact, I think he stopped writing poetry. I can't pretend to have any real understanding of the complex thought he engaged in over the next 30-odd years of his life, but back in the late 1790s, he was a young man who thought about poetry in poetry, and I feel more confident about following him there. When I too was young, I took Kubla Khan as a kind of poetry gospel. I'll summarize some ideas about Kubla Khan, and nothing I'm going to say about this beloved poem hasn't been said before. It's a common approach to talk about the poem as illustrating the creative process. Very baldly, a poem, he seems to say, is fueled by a powerful font of emotion that bursts forth and becomes a sacred river of language that is tamed by form. When the poem is shaped, emotion sinks into a deep, cold place, and at that spot where the feeling goes underground, an architectural wonder, the poem, is built. And Kubla Khan is a wonder of form. The poem itself is a wonder of form where the meter especially, but also his imagery, sort of enacts all these ideas. I've always taken this model, an architectural form balanced halfway between sun and the underworld, passion and ice, held together by form, its imagery, and language fertilized by feeling, as a model of a poem and a process. The second half of Kubla Khan makes similar claims for the dual nature of poetry, music, and its pattern making, sort of in tension with the chaotic possessed. This is a useful model. You can see that different poetic lineages emphasize one part of this process or system more than another. Spoken word might emphasize the font of emotion. The avant-garde poetic lineages might emphasize the sunny, brainy architectural wonder. Surrealists play in the shadow and the deep caves. But conventional poetics, if there is such a thing, from the Renaissance through to the Romantics to many poetries today, strive for that balancing act where the shadow of the dome of pleasure floated midway on the waves, where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain in the caves. I still believe Kubla Khan is as good a definition of poetry and its writing as anything that I've ever come across. I've become curious, though, about that image of the floating shadow and the pleasure dome situated, and maybe floating too, it's unclear, between sunny sky and icy cave. What are the forces that hold up that dome and contain that mingled measure? A while ago it struck me that Frost at Midnight might be a poem to explore, to tell me something I've not thought of. Midnight, after all, is betweenness, not one day or another. Midnight floats between today and tomorrow, held in the force field of time. So today I'd like to go on a thinking tour through Coleridge's Frost at Midnight, another of one of his most popular poems, and one that Sharon has also recently been thinking about or reading. I don't think it's too much to ask Coleridge to speak to me, an old, postmodern, feminist, humbled North American settler woman in 2023. I believe Coleridge can still teach us about poetry. He is a master, though he felt like a failure. His wonderful Kubla Khan model of poetry endures. And he was not in some ivory tower. The world or society seeps into his poetics. Kubla Khan vibrates with the ancestral voices prophesying war. Coleridge was writing in a time of political and cultural turmoil, the fallout of the French and American revolutions, political divisions, social upheaval around class, women, secularism, slavery. If you just look at the bottom of the page of the poem, or the bottom of the link for people online, you can see that this poem was first published in a book with words in the title like Alarm, Invasion, France. He was in at the very beginning of the left-right culture wars. When young, he participated in all kinds of experiments that we call countercultural. He was at the forefront of a new conviction that we needed to pay attention to nature. He was a superb literary and culture critic. He was also an addict, a man separated from his wife and family, a radical who some thought should be run out of town. He was poor, political, and essentially he lived the last years of his life in assisted living to deal with his illness and drug addiction. What might his poetry say to a culture that, like his, feels broken, divided, addicted, politically fractured, and seemingly falling apart? Or maybe these questions are way too big. How about just a simple question? What are artfulness and ice doing at this late midnight hour? Where, to quote Sharon from her poem, Coleridge was a Libra too, Coleridge observed the icicle's descent, the waning fire, the page laid bare upon the table. Part 2, the poem. In front of you is a copy of Frost at Midnight. I had intended to read the poem. Would that be okay? Mm-hmm. Okay. Frost at Midnight by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The frost performs its secret ministry, unhelped by any wind. The owlet's cry came loud, and hark again, loud as before. The inmates of my cottage, all at rest, have left me to that solitude which suits abstruser musings, save that at my side my cradled infant slumbers peacefully. 'Tis calm indeed, so calm that it disturbs and vexes meditation with its strange and extreme silentness. Sea, hill, and wood, this populous village, sea and hill and wood, with all the numberless goings-on of life, inaudible as dreams. The thin blue flame lies on my low burnt fire and quivers not. Only that film which fluttered on the grate still flutters there, the sole unquiet thing. Methinks its motion in this hush of nature gives it dim sympathies with me who live, making it a companionable form, whose puny flaps and freaks the idling spirit by its own moods interprets, everywhere echo or mirror, seeking of itself, and makes a toy of thought. But oh, how oft at school with most believing mind, presageful, have I gazed upon the bars to watch that fluttering stranger. And as oft with unclosed lids already had I dreamt of my sweet birthplace, and the old church tower whose bells, the poor man's only music, rang from morn to evening all the hot fair day, so sweetly that they stirred and haunted me with a wild pleasure, falling on mine ear most like articulate sounds of things to come. So gazed I till the soothing things I dreamt lulled me to sleep, and sleep prolonged my dreams. And so I brooded all the following morn, awed by the stern preceptor's face, mine eye fixed with mock study on my swimming book, save if the door half opened and I snatched a hasty glance, and still my heart leapt up, for still I hoped to see the stranger's face, townsman or aunt or sister more beloved, my playmate when we both were clothed alike. Dear babe that sleepest, cradled by my side, whose gentle breathings, heard in this deep calm, filled up the interspersed vacancies and momentary pauses of the thought. My babe so beautiful, it thrills my heart with tender gladness thus to look at thee, and think that thou shalt learn far other lore, and in far other scenes. For I was reared in the great city, pent mid cloisters dim, and saw not lovely but the sky and stars. But thou, my babe, shall wander like a breeze, by lakes and sandy shores, beneath the crags of ancient mountain, and beneath the clouds which emit in their bulk both lakes and shores and mountain crags. So shalt thou see and hear the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language, which thy God utters, who from eternity doth teach himself in all, and all things in himself. Great universal teacher, he shall mold thy spirit, and by giving make it ask. Therefore all seasons shall be sweet to thee, whether the summer clothe the general earth with greenness, or the red breast sit and sing betwixt the tufts of snow on the bare branch of mossy apple tree, while the nigh thatch smokes in the sun thaw, whether the eve drops fall heard only in the trances of the blast, or if the secret ministry of frost shall hang them up in silent icicles, quietly shining to the quiet moon. It's a mysterious poem. One thing that's noticeable for me when I started looking at it was how many an extraordinary number of opposites and dualities it contains. You know, the frost and the fire, outside, inside, light, dark, asleep, awake, city, country, child, parent, child away from home, child asleep in the bosom of its family, loudness, quietness, solitude, family, girl, boy. I can go on and on. Calm, vexed, memory, hope, future hope, summer, winter, meditation, blessing. There are many, many, many of these kind of oppositional sorts of concepts in here. The poem is scored by these divisions. The poem could become shattered by these splinters and cracks. And I think Coleridge realized that too, and bends it into a rondo, as he called it, ending where he begins, with the secret ministry of frost. So it begins where it ends, right, the secret ministry of frost, forcing this nest of division into a tight closed circle that contains past, present, and future, and the blank verse meter that it's written in gathers it all into a sleeve. You just look it down the page, it's this like beautiful sleeve of blank verse. What a lovely intact package. And yet still, it's marked by cracks like the frost etching the glass. As the poem does, let's start with the image of frost itself. crystalline cracks and feathery fronds growing on the cold outside surface of the window. The frost is performing, creating an image of fractures that cohere into a beautiful pattern upon a flat, smooth surface, like a page, as Sharon herself hints. So, oh, Coleridge, here you go again, writing about poetry as we knew you would. Coleridge's image is of the frost writing on the glass, while he, awake at midnight, is restless and agitated, and of course he's writing too, since the poem's written in the present tense. And all around him is the peace and quiet, a beloved child asleep beside him in a cradle, nearby a silent village, and surrounding him the quiet house. Yet he is awake and agitated. The quiet of the night is rent by an owl's cry, and you should think of the screech owl cry, like, rah, rah, not a nice hoo hoo of the great horned owl or something. It's a voice like his own, like his own thought, at odds with the quietness, the extreme silentness, as he says. He watches the low, still fire, and it too is at odds with his restlessness and his mood and his internal vexation. After acknowledging his restlessness, his inability to quiet himself, to even think about anything seriously, his thoughts are mere toys, his mind finally does rest upon something, the sole unquiet thing, as restless as he is, a stray piece of ashy film that flutters upon the grate. According to all the commentary on this poem, and there's lots of it, of course, this phenomenon of a piece of glowing ash or soot fluttering on the grate of the fireplace was called the stranger in the dialect of his time and place. So according to folklore, if you saw one of these embering ash attached to the grate, it was said to foretell a visitor, a stranger coming. So it was called the stranger. So at first the poet thinks that this fluttering flake of ash is a kind of emblem of his freaky, moody mind. But then he's struck by a memory, how he used to stare at a similar stranger when he was a boy in his schoolroom, remembering there's no central heating then, right? So everything was on fire. Coleridge was 9 years old when he was taken away from his family and his country village in Devon in the south of England and sent to a charity boarding school in the big city, London. His father had died a year previously. He was taken away, probably grieving greatly for his father, whom he seemed to have adored, torn away from his family and community and the natural world he loved. And as so many children in boarding schools and residential schools must have, the boy in the poem longs for a stranger, someone from home, to walk through the door of his classroom. He longs for a stranger to come walking through that door, one of his own dear absent ones. This is a very moving and powerful scenario if you think about it today. Partly with the resonance, as we've talked about already today, or mentioned, the residential schools that many of us are thinking about this week as we approach the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. The charity boarding school was a common institution in the 19th century of England. Those residential and charity schools honed their nastiness on the English poor. Remember Jane Eyre? Before they were transferred over to Canada and made instruments of genocide and cultural oppression, in addition to everyday child abuse. I think we see in Coleridge, in this poem, and possibly in his biography, that the vexatious, restless inability to have a peaceful mind in the present is linked to what we would now call past trauma. This link is made in many ways in this poem. Look at how the two scenes, the present and the past, mirror each other. In the present, the poet is sitting restless in a room with a child at his side, and the frost is writing away at the window, and he is staring at the fire, thinking of the dreamlike existence of the nearby village, sea and woods, all beyond his current perception. In the past memory tableau, he is sitting homesick in a room with children who are probably writing and reading around him, and he is staring at the fire, thinking of his dreams of his faraway village that are disturbing him and making him unable to focus on his study. The swimming book, tears in his eyes, possibly. These two mirrored situations open a gushing fountain of emotion, like in Kubla Khan. From this chasm with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this earth in fast thick pants were breathing, a mighty fountain momently was forced, it says in Kubla Khan. In Frost at Midnight, at this point, the language shifts into a kind of panting emotion. How oft, how oft. Oft is repeated 3 times in these few lines. It's a cry of gasping emotion. The wound of his traumatic childhood arises in his adult, unsettled mind. And at this point, his childhood mind, which is traumatized and caught in this lonely prison of school, was as restless and unsettled as his adult mind is now. He speaks of his childhood dreams, memories, and brooding. These situations, these 2, past and present, are not just similar. The states of mind seem vestigial and perpetual. This poem could have gone on to be a poem about mind and memory, possibly hinting at the trauma that runs through his life from childhood to adulthood, even if the poem had then moved to imagining his child's future, his hope for his child. This would be a poem that's about something a bit different than I think what it is about. Or obviously it could be both. Because instead of this straightforward movement into psychological awareness or dream of hope for his child, something shifts in the poem. When thinking of the people he most wants to walk into the room, Coleridge mentions his sister. Sister, most beloved, more beloved than a neighbor or aunt, my playmate, when we both were clothed alike. And it is at this point that the poem makes its shift. Coleridge, after he thinks of his sister, her name was Anne, and she was called Nancy, by the way. He thinks of how they were once clothed alike, and he turns. I imagine he physically turns in his seat, adjusts his body to look at and address his infant child. In spite of the fact that almost every commentary about this poem names this infant as his son Hartley, Coleridge does not call attention to the baby's name, which is not unremarkable since he often does name the people in his poems that when he's addressing them. Nor does he even mention the baby as a boy. He doesn't mark the child with a gender. The infant is probably wearing the skirts or dresses of all infants, similar to what he wore when he was a young child, when he was clothed like a girl, for girls remained clothed like infants, while boys grew up to wear pants. Most of the remaining poem is addressed to dear babe, a you, not a he, no whisper of the distinct category of gender anywhere in that address. The poem now turns its back on loss, trauma, and restlessness to an imagined future for this child, an idealized and holy education in freedom and nature. It is through this realization of a likeness between boys and girls, that the poem begins an imaginative work of repair. Though he has been traumatized by being torn away from family and community and nature and his sister, his baby would be free and wild, and every season would be a blessing. And the poem ends on one of the most lovely, delicate images of serenity. The secret ministry of frost shall hang them up in silent icicles, quietly shining to the quiet moon. Note the 2 quiets here. Quiet, quiet now. Shh. Note how off's panting away. As the poem comes full circle, the how offs are canceled out. There will be no agitated, fractured, traumatized mind here, not for this child. And perhaps the voice is the poet quieting his own mind. Quiet, quiet. The poem ends on a commitment, a blessing, a wish for wholeness, for still mind. How lovely and serene this ending is as it comes full circle. How well nature, memory, blessing, God and nature has done its work of healing and hope. We have the promise of a man who will not pass on intergenerational trauma to his child. We seem to have ended encircled in the pleasure dome, that rare device that contains but moderates emotion with its light and reverence. How lovely. Yet, I am suddenly aware that while we are in the pleasure dome, we are staring at the frost, the icicles, the silvery moonlight. We end the poem staring at the caves of ice. Part 3, the ending of the poem. What are the caves of ice? What is the sunless sea? Coleridge's friend Wordsworth also discussed creative process in his preface to the second edition of Lyrical Ballads, published in 1801. Wordsworth claims poetry arises from powerful emotion recollected in tranquility, a very famous phrase. In other words, emotion must be submerged in order to write a poem with the cool reason and architectural finesse that you need. Wordsworth and Coleridge had been talking together when Wordsworth wrote that preface, and they had some disagreements, but they were talking together. And when Coleridge wrote Kubla Khan and Frost at Midnight, they also were talking all the time. Emotions are tamed and held so the residual force can provide the grounding of the poem without overwhelming it. At the end of Frost at Midnight, we're in the lovely circular dome of blessing, hope, past, present, future. Then Coleridge turns us in our seats to look at that still and frozen emotion. This may be a reminder that emotion is the underpinning of any work of repair and reconciliation, as much as it is the source and foundation of a poem. But there are more riches in the ending of Frost at Midnight. The last stanza says, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, it says way more, but this is partly what it says, that with an education in nature and freedom, all will be sweet. Summer, of course, is sweet. It's obviously sweet. But all the other seasons, too, will be sweet. Summer is so obviously sweet, it gets a scant 1.5 lines. The next 8 lines are all about winter. This is an interesting textual imbalance. Is it just because he needs more room to be convincing about the wintry season? Summer is something we can easily enjoy, but icy darkness, not so much. We have to be persuaded. But notice how generic that summer line is, or 1.5 lines. Whether the summer clothed the general earth with greenness. That's all he describes of it. Summer gets pretty short shrift. It is general, just unbroken green. But the description repeats that word clothe that we have seen before in this poem, when we both were clothed alike. With that word, summer is pinned to not only a time of sweet ease, but also joined to a time of the untorn fabric of togetherness, the green wholeness of youth, the untraumatized mind. Possibly this reference to summer is so brief because it's not quite remembered. Certainly, summer's reference has none of the detailed particularness of the winter imagery. The red breast between the tufts of snow, on mossy apple trees, the thatched roof steaming as the sun hits the snow, the melting snow falling from the roof, the mantra of the roaring wind and storm, the icicles in the moonlight. Coleridge puts all his romantic, poetic mojo into the description of winter. These images are not a whole generic thing. They're not general. They're full of minuteness and contrasts. The rosy bird and white snow, the absent apples and the cloaking moss, all those complementary colors, red and green, and white, of course, storm and stillness, snow, but also steam and sun. I think what I find wondrous about this winter imagery is that it is saturated with summer feeling. The mention of the apple tree offers us a summer fruit. The word steam emits heat. Moss evokes the lush green general greenness that we heard about with summer. The rosy red breast is like a little hot coal or a flower in the snow. The images generate a warmth and nourishment that we don't expect of winter. Our expectations of winter are reversed in this visionary stanza. Or maybe winter and summer are subtly intertwined. Apples in winter, heat in winter, red and green in winter, moss and greenness doing their lush covering over. Summer and winter, different as they are clothed alike. Part 4, the conversation. Frost at Midnight is clustered with a series of other Coleridge poems labeled in the early 20th century as conversation poems. Almost all of the poems in this cluster address someone, a lady, a gentle-hearted Charles, Sarah, my love, or in this case, Coleridge's baby. The conversations may seem one-sided if you are looking for a verbal exchange. But as critics have noted, the quality of the conversation lies in the Old Middle English meaning of the word as living among, intimacy. To converse is to interact socially, to hold converse with. Converse also has a second meaning, a situation, object, or statement that is the reverse of another, or corresponds to it but transposes it in some way, as in conversely. The meaning comes out of a concept of turning, the concept of turning that's found in the Latin root conversus, or turned about. And as most poets know, that even tinier root word, verse, is from the Latin word for turn, and where we get the word verse for poetry from, referencing the physical turning of the line from the right margin back to the left, or the unit of sound off to the next unit of sound. The memory of Coleridge's childhood and his likeness with his sister turns him towards his own child. Almost as if he said, I had a terrible event in my childhood, but conversely, here is my own child. Conversely to his childhood riven by exile, conversely to being divided into gender roles, conversely, he seems to say, there is my child, who will not be exiled, who will always be home on lake shores and under clouds and mountains, my own child, whom I will not split with a gender in this poem, who will be schooled by the great multiverse of nature and a God aligned with goodness and wholeness. I will reverse the trauma of my childhood in this child, who is not me, who is different, yet who is of me. Projecting an opposite childhood is like the projected image of frost on the window as writing. Frost is a kind of negative image of writing. And by negative, I mean in the photographic sense. The white writing of frost on the dark midnight window is like a visual inversion of a page. And here's where I'm going to make a claim then, that this poem reverses time, destiny, structures. Coleridge says in Frost at Midnight that poems can be reversal machines, but not simplistic ones. Coleridge, in his prodigiously genius way, demonstrates that a poem is a kind of conversation structured by conversely's, not a tool for turning back the clock. Frost at Midnight is a model of experiencing reversal as well as forwardness, experiencing division as well as likeness. It's not a going back to what was before. In a poem, you can go back to the left margin, but you're always one line down. But through turning and conversation, repair and reversals in perception and thought can happen. In the reversal of making winter sweet, what seems different is indeed different, but it is also strangely interconnected with what is opposite. Winter and summer are not opposing poles with no connection. When boys and girls are clothed alike, they are different, but we treat them more the same. A poem is an orchestration of conversely's, a symphony of conversely's that become one piece of music. In the final stanza, Coleridge is struggling mightily to synthesize, to make what is separate, interdependent, and entwined. As the philosopher Peter Chain says in his book, Coleridge's Contemplative Philosophy, Coleridge's aim of overcoming alienation includes incorporating opposed theories. End of quote. Coleridge wants to put everything in conversation. Conversation rarely changes fixed positions, but it can soften them or momentarily alter them through listening. If you can accept an opposing idea into your mind, you are capable of newly minted thought. Frost at midnight begins and ends in the same place, in the secret ministry of frost. But the ending is nevertheless a new place. The ending and the beginning of the poem are not the same, although they are clothed alike. At the beginning of the poem, there is agitation. At the end, there's peace. At the beginning, the frost performs alone, unhelped by any wind. At the end, the frost collaborates with the moon. Reversal is the nature of a line of poetry, and reversal is the nature of correction and repair. Conversation connects and incorporates, offers opportunity for acknowledging difference and alikeness, of creating a delicate unification out of separateness. And conversation is made of reversals, the give and take of holding converse. Part 5, the poem's work. Our troubled world lacks conversation and it lacks poetry. Chain, who studies Coleridge's philosophy and whom I cited above, says Coleridge's approach grew from his celebrated powers of synthesis. Seeing polarized debates as revealing an interdependent whole, he tried to embrace the views of his philosophical opponents rather than simply dismiss them. The view of a higher union of opposites leads to reasoning, while binary thinking leads merely to arguing. End of quote. For Coleridge, conversation is a sacred act. In Frost at Midnight, God is the great universal teacher who shall mold the spirit and by giving make it ask. This is a fine depiction of a genuine conversation. If you give me your ideas and thoughts, and I am prompted to ask a question, in other words, I don't refute, yell at you, try to shut you up, shame you, or whatever passes for non-conversation, then we have a connection and a conversation. You give, I ask, and turn it back to you. When I teach poetry, I like to talk about the trick of the turn. Somewhere in the last third of the poem, often something shifts. There's a volta, a path that veers into different territory. Sometimes it builds up over several lines, sometimes it jolts you in the last line. The sonnet is a poetry machine that foregrounds this turn, but many poems have it. It's that experience when reading or hearing a poem where you suddenly feel nudged off a little bit and you're not quite sure how you got there, or you realize you're on a roller coaster instead of a train. You get a surprise, right? The conversely, the reversal, the shift moves the poem from one position to another without breaking the poem. The surprise can happen when you're writing a poem, too. You know you've got something when you're writing and you realize your poem is taking you somewhere totally out of the blue. Or conversely, you realize the poem you're writing hasn't moved. It's a bit of a lump. It hasn't turned. It will never, ever be some wild animal that suddenly stops, turns, and stares at you. You've failed to give birth to a living thing whose perceptions are not quite your own. In Levels and Opposites, Structure and Poetry, a fine and quite funny and opinionated essay on dialectic poetic structure by the American poet Randall Jarrell, he says that, quote, a successful poem starts from one position and ends at a very different one, often a contradictory or opposite one, yet there has been no break in the unity of the poem. A poem with its lines, its forms, its images, is in constant motion, knitting itself into oppositions, into new ways of seeing. Coleridge tells us poems do extremely complex work. Poems are not arguing. Poems are a kind of complex reasoning, not reasoning by logic, but reasoning by lyric. And lyric is impossible to argue with. A poem that tries to argue, that never employs reversal, that avoids conversation, that doesn't give and take in order to ask, would be a monomonster. A polemic, an ideology, a dogma, a lousy, boring poem. Frequently in our society, we see single-minded positions, people unable or unwilling to hold converse with those they disagree with. Coleridge was all too aware of these divisions in public and artistic discourse. Left and right, elite oppressed, old and new, conservative and radical, and the toxic, ungiving language of opposing sides. The theologian John Milbank has written of Coleridge that his significance is not that he anticipated many of our contemporary concerns, but rather that he, quote, stands alongside us on the margins of still unresolved problems. End of quote. I feel Coleridge standing alongside us as we attempt to have difficult conversations and struggle to write poems in difficult times. His poems chart the power of interconnected lyric reasoning. In a world where we create binaries of us and them, and where we are entrenched in our righteousness and moral certainties, he makes the case for poetry as being an act of unification through, not in spite of, our differences. Although I'm not sure I have answered my question about how the sunny pleasure dome stays floating above all those forces of sea and river and ice and sun, I love how Frost at Midnight ends with a trembling unity as we stare into the caves of ice from the perch of our imperfect circle. Midnight is ready to tip over into tomorrow, but not quite yet. Frost hovers in a transition phase between states of matter, from water vapor to crystalline solid. Those beautiful, quiet, gleaming icicles are a dream of water, poised to drop, splinter, or melt away. And all is clothed alike in moonlight. The poem ends here, because to see this poise, this timeless state of what was, is, and will be, and to have set it all in a lyric bowl of conversation, is the secret ministry. Like an X-ray, like a cubist painting, in the 3 lines at the end of Frost at Midnight, the poem's great work is radically exposed. Thank you. So happy to have a conversation if anyone wants to.
Looking at the poster, which I have up in my office at home, and I thought, oh, conversation poet. That sounds like Coleridge. I say Coleridge. And so it's really interesting. I really love and before, well, I was very, very moved by your talk in so many ways. In so many ways, I felt returned to a vision of poetics that remains through Coleridge and through everything, and can be used in sense, remind us of the nature of poetry and this whole wonderful idea of conversation within poetics. And yes, I did do my MA thesis back in 1971 on the whole. I can't even remember the title. But what I did was I was trying to read Coleridge's poetics through his criticism of Shakespeare. So, when you were talking about, I didn't know this, about being shipped off to school, boarding school at age 9 after his father died. I just remember something about something consistent in his criticism, his actual criticism of parts of Shakespeare, or maybe certain plays, that he felt that the tragic event, the violent event, was not adequately prepared for, so that the audience would be too shocked, or it would seem odd, or a musician. And now thinking about what happened to him in his young life, and his, I can see why that would be a critical. So you will, I hope, indulge what is the moving thing, the connection here, are the visible sense that she was talking about poetry. I didn't know that. So listen to this. I was thinking today about poetry. How poetry declines to serve power and division and separation, and works within the divine possibility that imagination is. It seems to me that imagination is best activated by the immensity that language belongs to. It seems to me that a poem is out there as much as, or even more than, it is in here. When I saw Nancy's title, Conversation Poetics, I was taken back to Coleridge's sense of a conversation poem. Poems that are talking with and not to someone or something else. This sort of intimacy, of friendship, really, that Coleridge practiced. In fact, he edited a magazine of literary criticism and philosophy called The Friend. That was the title of his critical journal. Imagine that nowadays, as I said. Anyway, there's a sweetness in that. And there is in this poem. And I've heard of the practice of sweetening the wine. You don't pour sugar over it. You let it sing its own innocent tune. And anyway, I jotted these notes down before Nancy's beautiful talk, so excuse their wanderings around and accept my deepest thanks, Nancy, and to all of you here, and to the Faculty of Creative and Critical Studies for this talk, for this series of talks, which I'm so thrilled and honored by. And thank you all for coming out, and thank you those who are watching tonight from home. Yeah. The piece of cloth is from Nancy brought back from the travels in India. Oh, thank you. I think I say conversation. There's a conversation on this all. But what a marvelous exegesis and lecture. It is so gratifying. It gave such deep and terrific on not just the Coleridge, but to the poetry itself. In a time when such honorings are even far between.
Yeah, true.
Anyway, I'm going to go.
One of the things I thought somebody might ask is what happened to the child, right? Because I think that's an interesting question. Because
what did?
Yeah, well, he actually did live a really lovely life out in the in the wild. Like he was let run around in the fields and played in nature and had a lovely childhood, it seems. But of course, Coleridge left. He left his family, and so the Hartley became a poet as well, and you can actually read his poetry. They're quite lovely poems, but he was people talked about him as being very damaged. Coleridge was not able to stop the intergenerational trauma. Really, he perpetuated some of it, and Hartley became an alcoholic, and he, like Coleridge, ended up living with people who would put up with him. He would go from house to house, but he was considered very charming and lovable, so people would look after him. But he eventually died of alcohol poisoning. When he was quite young, early 40s, I think. Yeah.
Well, that's a cheerful.
I know. Not a happy ending, no. But just neither is Coleridge. Coleridge is like.
Well, look at us here.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of related to that. I really love this. I mean, your
Well, I think it's interesting how the word conversus, that Latin word, has became these two kinds of meanings in English, which are probably there in the Latin too, to converse with, to hold converse, to be in social intimacy with, and also to be against or opposite. Like that's a weird word, right? Like it's a strange etymology, and I think it contains that kind of paradox within it. And I don't really know what that means. I haven't thought far enough maybe about that, but I think it seems to indicate that you can't have intimacy and a social life without opposition and turns and back and forth, and maybe you can't get through life without trauma in some way. Maybe not as horrible as children pulled from their families. Yeah. But you're right, the turns here are harsh. Yeah, they're harsh. But yeah, it's a beautiful poem.
It's an incantation, right? In a sense, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, quiet, quiet. Yeah.
Incantation is partly always about a thing that doesn't exist or isn't yet so. So there's always this feeling of this reaching.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. And that's what, the end of Kubla Khan, the incantatory kind of language. It's that suffering. I want what I want. I want something. That Buddhist suffering. Oh, sure.
It says, are you really interested in the gender piece? That Coleridge would see gender as a kind of prison, as gender.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, I think there's something about that line in that poem that just really caught me, because he's speaking of a trauma. He's thinking of, at some point, I was separated from my sister, and once we were clothed alike. And I think that just reminded me of how strange our gender markers are, and that in the 18th century and before, you would dress your children in dresses until they were about four or five, and then when they became gendered, or you put your boy in pants or shorts or whatever they were wearing. And it seems to me, and that the girls remained infants. And so I think that sounds traumatic for both genders. Like, suddenly you're torn away from what you were and put into some other costume, but also the girl child is reminded that she will never be allowed to do that. She will have to wear dresses for the rest of her life. So yes, gender, I think, is a form of trauma, right? When you are marked in that really strong way. So that, I think that is in the poem. I think that Coleridge is pointing that out, because I think he was, as you said, he's full of turn. He's full of these awarenesses of these breaks and turns and traumas in his life. And his poetry is so much about that, right? I think that's why he couldn't end some poems, why he felt like a failure as a poet, right? Because he felt that he was always in these broken places. And I think it was just interesting. I don't know if I know much about him. I know that he actually had quite a troubled relationship with women. He was often quite awful. But he also longed for, love and connection with someone. I don't know if that in any way answered anything that you asked, but I think it's a great question. Great. Well, I think we should have a glass of wine or something. Yeah.